get to it. There we are. Good afternoon, Secular Fam. Welcome to everyone that's joining us today. Please put your name in the chat and be sure to change the settings from hosts and panelists to everyone so that we all know that you're here. We are just 5 days into the Broligarchy, and this fresh hellscape is worse than I could have ever imagined. Like me, you may be feeling overwhelmed and anxious and uncertain, and those feelings may ebb and flow from minute to minute. Everything we're feeling is normal right now. Just this week, I had a high speed come apart, and my friends and colleagues wrapped their loving arms around me and supported me until I was on more solid footing. So, this is our new normal. I encourage all of you to give yourselves some grace because there are going to be days where you need to lean on someone else. And then there might be days where you're the one holding others up. So these Friday discussions are vital to my own well-being. And I'm just so happy that we come here in fellowship every Friday. And I hope that they help you too. But for today, we are speaking to Dr. Patricia Zavella. Okay, I got it. Her latest book is The Movement for Reproductive Justice, Empowering Women of Color Through Social Activism, New York University Press, 2nd edition, 2024. Zavella received the American Anthropological Association's Committee on Gender Equity and Anthropology Award, the Association of Latina and Latino Anthropologists Distinguished Career Award, and Scholar of the Year by the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies. She serves on the boards of 3 nonprofit organizations: Community Agroecology Network, California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, and National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. Whoa, that is quite the resume. She has 2 children and 3 adorable grandchildren, and her hobbies are yoga, Pilates, walking, reading, and watching films. So welcome today, Professor, Pat. I'm so excited that you're here today. I know that you have a presentation. Is there anything that I missed on your bio?
No, everything went very smoothly. And I love the broligarchy. I'm going to use.
I have to admit that I did steal that from a journalist, and it was a Guardian article. I'll see if I can find it and throw it in the chat. It was titled "How to Survive the Broligarchy," so I can't claim that term. All right,
Okay.
I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'm going to turn my screen off.
Okay. And I'm going to try to pull up a PowerPoint just to show you some images from the research that I've done. And I may need some help doing that.
Well, make sure that you have it open as a tab.
It's open. Okay.
And then there's a share button at the bottom. It is green. You should see that hopefully at the bottom at this, maybe on the top or the side of your Zoom.
Yeah. Okay. Here we go.
Perfect.
Okay. Sorry for the awkwardness. Zoom presentations happened after I retired. So I'm still getting the hang of it. Okay, so I'll be speaking about the movement for reproductive justice based on the book that I published originally in 2020. The 2nd edition was published in 2024. And as she mentioned, I serve on 2 reproductive justice boards of directors. And so I feel like that's been so wonderful to see sort of how the sausage is made. And it's been incredibly insightful to sort of be on the inside of this movement. I did research between 2013 and 2018, which sort of spanned the Obama and the Trump administration. So it was also really interesting to see sort of being in a moment when we felt like we were moving forward in relation to the interests of women of color and reproductive rights. And then the Trump administration, which, as you all know, very much cut back on women's access to reproductive rights. And he really sort of promoted some anti-immigrant and, frankly, anti-female discourse. So it was like night and day. And so I got to see how the movement adjusted to those kinds of changes. The movement for reproductive justice very much defines itself as being distinct from the movement for reproductive rights. And you all may be familiar with some of the major organizations like the Center for Reproductive Rights based in New York. that brings about lawsuits and really sort of advocates globally on behalf of women's reproductive rights. The movement for reproductive justice also distinguishes itself from organizations that provide reproductive health services. And of course, Planned Parenthood is probably the one that most of us are familiar with. And so the RJ movement sees itself as being allied with these two social movements, but they really sort of define themselves very differently. And part of what I'll go into their definition in a minute, but part of what they're doing is very much engaging in long-term social activism. So this is a movement where the phrase reproductive justice was coined in 1994 by African-American women in Chicago. It wasn't until the early 2000s that many of these reproductive justice organizations were founded. And Sister Song, which is sort of a collaborative organization that includes African-American, Latina, Native American, and Asian American organizations and Muslim women, was formed and continues today. So some of these organizations have over a 30-year history of doing reproductive justice work. And I should point out that what was attracted me to this movement was, on the one hand, many of them work with racially, ethnically specific populations. So Black Women for Wellness, Tewa Women United, California Latinas Reproductive Justice, et cetera, et cetera. And they also are very locally involved, literally involved in local politics. At the same time, this social movement uses the terminology of women of color. And so they're very much always negotiating, how do we pay attention to the very specific histories and cultures and languages of our populations in local places, and then how do we collaborate across states and across the nation? And we use the phrases women of color. So there are over 30 reproductive justice organizations in the United States, and there's one in Canada. And so I've been trying to follow them. And since I did my research, I was asked to join 3 reproductive justice organizations boards, besides California Latinas for Reproductive Justice and National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. I also served for a while on the Illinois Caucus for Adolescent Health based in Chicago. So I have remained on the listservs. I get lots of emails as our oligarchy has unfolded in the last few days. I'm getting a lot more emails and calls to action. And so I very quickly realized that I was attuned to what this movement does. And I identified myself as an ally, and I very much consider myself now a part of the movement. So I'm going to sort of explain what this movement is all about. So this movement sees its mission as using the human rights framework and the framework of intersectionality. And their mission is the human right to have children. And so here they're critiquing that sterilization abuse that has been perpetrated against women of color since the 19th century. And they argue that women have the right to have children. And if that means large families, so be it. And they really push back on all of the discourse that sort of raises stereotypes about women of color as having too many children or their families are too large. One of the things that drew me to this movement is yes.
Excellent.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. So the mission is the human right to have children. And as I was saying, I'm the oldest of 12 children. And when I saw this mission, I thought, oh, this would embrace my mother and other women in my family who have large families. Okay, their mission is also the human right to not have children. And so they very much support abortion rights and women's efforts to terminate their pregnancies, even if that means sometimes termination happens at a later phase in the pregnancy. Their mission includes the human right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. So that really means that they're paying attention to the local context and to the history of different organizations and populations, free from reproductive oppression. and the human right to bodily autonomy that includes gender identity. And so they very much support people's right to choose what gender identity they would like. This image on the right sort of was coined by one of the organizations to sort of show how they very much see themselves aligned with other rights. So queer rights, environmental justice, ending violence against women, workers' rights, etc. Okay, so they use, as I mentioned, the framework of intersectionality. And of course, what this means is the co-construction of power, the way in which white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity, as well as other power relations like legal status or like religion, the way in which some religions are valued over others, the way in which these intersect, and individuals have a particular social location, and we can name our social location. I'm a Chicana of working class heritage woman who identifies as heterosexual. But it also pays attention to social categories within these intersecting systems of power. And this movement very much advocates for the structurally vulnerable, trans people, young people, undocumented women, Spanish speakers, African Americans, those with low incomes of any racial heritage. So intersectionality is something that you hear about daily as this movement does its work. And then the other part of their framework is human rights. And it's not a framework that pays attention to individuals necessarily, but really sort of looks for structural changes that facilitate the health and well-being of everyone, particularly those who are structurally vulnerable. So that means this movement allies itself with those organizations and movements that are working on behalf of making sure that jobs have living wages and benefits that enable debt-free lives, that enable people's access to nutritious food, that enables parks and open space where it's safe to exercise and you have clean air, that advocates for systems that allow for clean drinking water. They ally themselves with movements that work on behalf of good educational systems where students learn to question inequality and discover remedies and find their passions. It's not just about individual training, but again, looking at the social context. They ally themselves with social organizations and movements that advocate for good healthcare systems that are accessible to everyone, including the undocumented. And they also use a human rights framework that's very, as my colleague Rosalinda Fregoso calls it, decolonial, in the sense that they advocate for the protection of the land, of Mother Earth, of mountains, of rivers, of forests, and really advocate for sustainable agriculture and food sovereignty. So this is a very particular approach to human rights. So there are sort of three sets of strategies that this social movement engages in. One is base building, that is grassroots organizing. So they very much see that as what defines them as distinct from those organizations that provide reproductive health services and those organizations that engage solely in reproductive health policy. And base building is very much about educating low-income women of color about their human rights and providing workshops and trainings and sort of having a long-range engagement so that women literally become involved in this social movement for years. They also engage in policy advocacy, and this can be at the local level, at the city level, that is, or county level, state level, or federal level, sort of writing bills or testifying before Congress or lobbying state legislators, trying to get policies passed and resources allocated to implement good policies. And then the social movement also engages in culture shift work or narrative shift work. That is, they very much critique all of the racist, sexist, pejorative stereotypes and comments and representations about women of color, things like welfare queens, or the way in which Latinas supposedly have too many babies, And they try to draw on the strength and resiliency of communities of color and advocate for looking for how have we survived the historical traumas that our communities have experienced, how are we strong, and how can we draw on that strength to engage in policy advocacy and base building. So 3 sets of strategies that they're always involved in. One example of culture shift work. This is the Soy Poderosa campaign, which means I am a powerful woman, organized by the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice way back in 2013. They had it going for several years. And as you can see, there are pictures by different people who hold up a sign that says, Soy Poderosa, I am a powerful woman. And then they give their reason why. And one of the things that was very interesting to me is these are allies, different organizations that they work with. And when you look at them, you begin to question, is that woman in the upper right-hand corner, is she Latina? Is she white? What is her heritage? Not really clear. This person in the lower right-hand corner who says, I am a feminist, and he's using the feminine pronouns. He looks like a white guy to me, but he's claiming a feminine identity. So that raises questions about his gender identity. The woman in the lower left-hand corner, maybe African-American, maybe Afro-Latina. Again, it raises questions about these participants. And then the women in the upper left-hand corner are former executive directors of National Latina Institute. The photo taken in the middle, and you can find me there in the middle, was taken at the Leadership Institute that was held in McAllen, Texas, and their staff there, but also these are the participants, and many of these women are low income and undocumented and Spanish speaking. And the big banner in front says Somos Poderosas, which is a gender neutral way of saying we are powerful people. And it's gender inclusive. And so there's this ongoing call to solidarity, to people identifying with the movement, and to being welcoming to people of all racial, ethnic heritage and gender identities. This is an example of base building or grassroots organizing. 2 photos taken in South Texas, where I did a lot of my research. And on the photo on the left, that is Lucy Ceballos Felix, one of the main organizers, and she's doing a presentation at the Leadership Institute. And I took the photo from behind, again, because some of these women are undocumented. And one of the things she was talking about in this particular instance was the way in which health problems have structural origins. So you'll see in the back of the photo, there are these trees, and we had broken up into small groups and we brainstormed what are the kinds of health issues that we see in colonias. And colonias, of course, are unincorporated communities where people buy a little piece of land and then they build their own homes, sometimes bring in some trailers or RVs, sometimes have to truck in water. Electricity isn't always happening. There aren't paved roads necessarily. And these are places where there are high percentages of single parents and lots of health issues like very high rates of diabetes, obesity, higher rates of cancers, respiratory issues, asthma. And so we brainstorm, what are all of the health issues that we see in the colonias? And we put them on little stickies, a little bit hard to see. And those were the leaves of the trees. And then the lecture was about what are the root causes of these health problems? Capitalism, racism, the way in which, if you look at the Rio Grande Valley, it's a beautiful region, and yet there's very high unemployment. There are hardly any good jobs. The educational system is not that well organized. Not that many people go to college. The health system has severe restrictions, and you all may be familiar with the way in which the Texas legislature curtailed clinics' access to providing abortions because they needed to have an affiliation with a surgical center, and that meant that a bunch of clinics closed down. That means that so many women had fewer clinics to access, and so their healthcare was delayed. And National Latina Institute did a bunch of research doing interviews with women, what does that mean in terms of your access to healthcare? And for many of them, it took months to even get in to see a doctor. So this whole discussion was very much about structural inequalities that these women face in their communities. The image on the left is Lucy Ceballo Felix at a demonstration that was held near the US-Mexico border. And you can see signs where women are saying, I would like to live happy without fear. We are the border. We are demanding liberty. We deserve health, dignity, and justice. So this was one of the many demonstrations that this organization has held to protest border enforcement and the way in which ICE raids create terror in the local communities. An example of policy advocacy. These are a series of images about different types of policy advocacy. So on the upper left-hand corner is a photo that I took at a human rights hearing that was held in McAllen, Texas. The image in the middle are photos of some of the women who testified at these hearings that began with a training, Human Rights 101, that was in Spanish, so that people from the local community could learn about human rights. And these women gave their testimony about what does it mean to not have access to healthcare. And so that we heard heartbreaking stories of a woman who was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And by the time she got in to see the doctor, it had metastasized and she died not too long afterwards. We heard the story of a family whose 13-year-old daughter had some kind of discharge from her breast. And by the time they got it diagnosed, it turns out there is a federal program that will work with undocumented women who are breast cancer victims, but their daughter was too young and the family couldn't afford healthcare. And so they were unclear what they were going to do to help their daughter. There was a story of a young woman who was an undergraduate student, got pregnant, decided to terminate her pregnancy, and with the help of her boyfriend, had to drive all the way to San Antonio, which, if you know Texas, is pretty far away from McAllen, Texas. And she also had to go through an immigration checkpoint to even get to San Antonio, which means that she is a legal permanent resident or a US citizen. And so if you're undocumented, of course, you're not going to drive through an immigration checkpoint. And so we heard story after story of how these women were struggling just to get access to basic reproductive health care. They were trying to get the Texas legislature to change legislation. That hasn't happened yet, but National Latina Institute continues to push for changes in Texas. The image on the upper right-hand corner was taken in Washington, D.C. You all may remember the demonstration on behalf of comprehensive immigration reform. These were over 100 women from around the country who came and had a demonstration. They were seated and arrested, and some of these women were undocumented. And I happened to interview some of the executive directors of reproductive justice organizations the day before the demonstration, and they were like going to the airport to pick up people, and they were trying to figure out housing and how we're going to feed people. And it was an incredibly impressive demonstration. And as you know, we still don't have comprehensive immigration reform. The image on the bottom right-hand corner is from the Respect ABQ Women campaign that was held in Albuquerque, New Mexico, back in, I believe it was 2018. There was an effort by the religious right to pass municipal legislation in Albuquerque that would have halted abortions after 20 weeks. And it was, they discovered that it was sort of an effort to see if they could get this happen in lots of different cities. And so Albuquerque was sort of the test case. And so various reproductive justice organizations set up a coalition and they advocated to get out the vote. Many of them went door to door in Latina communities. And the assumption was by some of their allies was Latinas and Latinos don't support abortion. We're never going to be able to resist this. But in fact, they did. They were successful in stopping this attempt to ban abortion in Albuquerque, which in many ways was sort of the center for the entire state of New Mexico. And it was an incredible effort. And then the image on the lower left-hand corner is from Forward Together, an organization based in Oakland that works with Asian American youth. And in California, we have the right to comprehensive sex education, but the reality is that there aren't enough resources to train teachers and to buy curricula. And so these young people organized a survey, and they did over 750 surveys with youth in different public and private schools in Oakland and asked them about their experiences getting access to sex education, and found that it varies tremendously. Some youth in Oakland were getting abstinence only sex education, some youth were getting decent sex education. But they also heard a lot of stories about particularly Asian American youth have a real hard time talking to their parents about sexuality and sexual relations, and negotiating the cultural issues around sexuality. And they really wanted a safer space at the school where they could talk to someone and sort of work through things like coming out as queer or getting an abortion or finding contraception. And so they went to Congress to legislate for more resources to implement the policy that was already on the books in California. This social movement advocates on behalf of health and wellness, and they very much draw on the definition offered by the World Health Organization, which views health and wellness as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not just the absence of disease or infirmity, and really sort of look for support by public health systems, sanitation, occupational and environmental conditions, education, nutrition, and non-discriminatory medical treatment. And this social movement very much advocates for the right to cultural sensitivity in healthcare settings, a full information, and that people receive healthcare with dignity. Of course, we know that the current president has rescinded our participation in the World Health Organization, but still, this is the value that this movement advocates for. They also value what they call healing justice, which is a non-religious or a secular form of spiritual activism. And this was something that I hadn't expected to find. I wasn't looking for this. And I came across it over and over again. And healing justice is a framework that was coined by social activists that very much responds and intervenes in generational trauma and violence, and brings collective practices that transform the consequences of oppression on our bodies, hearts, and minds. So this is sort of a framework that very much says we can't just look at social movements and social organizing with our heads and try to figure out strategies that will work. We need to bring in people's hearts and minds, and we need to pay attention to their spiritual heritage. Like, what moves people? What are their passions? What do they care about? And so healing justice asks us to cultivate the conditions that might allow us to feel more whole and connected to ourselves, the world around us, and other human beings. And in my book, I talk about what this looks like in different organizations. I think it's safe to say that as a whole, the reproductive justice movement very much honors that people they work with come from different religious heritages. The African American Church, for example, Catholicism, evangelicalism, Hinduism, that people have their heritage, and that even if they're not necessarily practicing, that's important to them. And many of the people who are involved in this movement are practicing their religious faith. At the same time, they feel like we should have a secular form of spiritual activism that is promoting wellness and the honoring people's whole selves. And so that might mean something like, when you go to a conference, it's not just about presentations, but it's let's take time to have some activity. Let's have a little bit of chair yoga, or let's dance, or let's sing. It means that in organizations having their department meetings, they might begin with collective meditation or burning sage, or asking women to write about the kinds of personal struggles that they're dealing with at home. It means in the case of one organization that when the pandemic happened and everyone couldn't come into the office to work anymore, that they literally purchased computers and ergonomic chairs and desks so that people could have a healthy way to work in their home environments. So you see reproductive justice organizations trying to bring well-being into how the organizations function. There are also some organizations that literally bring spiritual practices into the work that they're doing. Table Women United is one of the most prominent of these. And during the Q&A, we can talk about that if we have time. I'm mindful that I'm running out of time. Okay, one of the things I learned from these activists is the very strong belief that if you have this holistic approach to activism, that the process of engaging in activism itself is healing. As one of the women said, while you are struggling, you are healing. And another woman sort of chimed in and said, having a voice brings the power that carries women and transforms them. Gaining a voice is healing. And so this image was taken at one of the events that National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice organized. And they began with a prayer meeting before they had their political activities. And so the different activities that they engage in include things like storytelling. Many of these organizations will have storytelling projects where women literally tell their stories about accessing reproductive health. They'll tell them in small groups. Sometimes the organizations will have a project where you post your stories online or you tell them publicly. I was involved in one leadership institute with Spanish-speaking women, and it was so powerful to hear a 63-year-old migrant from Guatemala who was a Spanish speaker and undocumented talk about how she had 6 kids and she decided she didn't want to have any more children. Her husband was a machista. She decided to migrate to the United States. She's here living with her daughter. And she said, I don't want to have any more kids. I have the right to my own body. All of this, she said to a group of us, or about 20 of us. And it was so empowering to hear her claim her bodily autonomy. We have lots of stories of young people who talk about getting pregnant before they had planned to, terminating their pregnancy, what it was like to be a teenager, going to school and having a child. These kinds of stories are incredibly bonding. They create solidarity, and they also teach one another about sort of the common kinds of structural vulnerabilities that these women face. Women gain knowledge and skills while they're involved in the movement for reproductive justice. Virtually all of them have had Know Your Rights workshops where they have lawyers come in and talk about what do you do if ICE knocks on your door or you get picked up? What do you say? What should you anticipate is going to happen to you? How can you advocate for yourself? They've learned how to analyze social problems and propose remedies. And so they'll talk about why is there such high unemployment in our community? What can we do so that people can have better wages and better living conditions? What kind of legislation would make that possible? They learn how to write and speak publicly. The human rights hearings was a good example where these women began by writing out their stories, and then they read one another's stories and they practiced reading them so that they wouldn't be really nervous. And initially they thought, there's no way I can do this. But by the time they got to the human rights hearings, they were incredibly poised and well-spoken, and it was very successful. They learn how to lobby. I've been in meetings with state legislators with undocumented Spanish-speaking women, one of whom brought her 2 little girls with her, and she was advocating for immigration reform. And she said, I'm a single parent. If I get picked up and deported to Mexico, who's going to take care of my kids? It's very stressful to me to think that ICE might do roundups in my community. We really need better legislation. And it was so interesting to see the state legislator like, oh my God, like this is really dire, like we need to do something. And so people are engaging in lobbying in ways that they never would have thought they would have. Protesting, particularly in places like South Texas, where people told me we never have large demonstrations here. There was a whole workshop on how to organize a protest or a demonstration. And they laid out there are 10 roles involved in a demonstration, everything from who gets the permits to who does the chanting and who organizes the security and who makes sure that no one's getting left behind. And so we had a little mock demonstration at the university campus where the Leadership Institute was held. And we were all walking around saying, somos poderosas, and we deserve the rights to access reproductive health. And these women were so powerful and strong. And at the end of it, we did a debrief and they were like, that was my first demonstration. I had no idea that I could scream out and demand that certain things happen in this world. And then finally, there's a real liberatory imaginary happening in this social activism, where as women begin to analyze that their troubles are not just their individual ones, but something that's happening in their community, and they begin to anticipate what would make things better, they get an image of, wouldn't it be nice if everyone had access to education? Wouldn't it be nice if everyone had good jobs and good benefits? Wouldn't it be nice if we all had access to reproductive health care? And that vision is something that really fuels their continued activism. I'm going to stop here, just point out these two photographs. One on the left was in front of the White House after the Whole Women v. Hellerstedt Supreme Court decision that seemed to affirm women's rights, reproductive rights. Of course, we know that the Dobbs decision removed them. But at this moment, it was a moment of celebration. There were young women and men wearing T-shirts that said "Somos poderosas," we deserve health, dignity, and justice. And again, this is a social movement that advocates on behalf of pregnant people and women of color, but yet very much welcomes the participation of men. The image on the right was taken in South Texas, and as you can see, there are people of all ages, there are multiple generations, people bring their children, and of course they're provided childcare and lunch as they have these meetings. And so you're beginning to see sort of intergenerational activism and training and conversation about things that in many instances had been silent. And so what you see then is really sort of long-term social activism, and people like Lucy Felix and her mom, who's there in the red hair in the corner, saying, I may not see all of these changes happening in my lifetime, but they might happen in the lifetime of my children or my grandchildren. And so it's an incredibly inspiring approach that many of these activists bring to their social activism. I'm going to stop there, and I'm sure you all have some questions and comments, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I can figure out how to do that.
Perfect. There should be a little green button. There you go. You got it. Okay, perfect. We do have a question in the chat, and it comes from Jay. He wants to know, is the reproductive justice movement largely funded locally or through each organization? Is there a national or centralized funding source?
Great question. So these are all nonprofit organizations, which mean that they apply for grants from different foundations. They apply for government funds if there are special programs, and they rely on individual donors. So one of the things that happens in every one of these organizations is every year there's a fundraising campaign. And the executive directors have become quite skilled at getting grants that will fund their activities over multiple years, but it's usually never enough, and there's always more work to do. And so they really would invite individuals to give during their donor campaigns. And I'm always impressed by the amount of money that they get and how they make their money go far. Like they really are trying to get as much activity as they can out of the resources that they have.
Considering all the sweeping things that are happening right now, pulling out of the World Health Organization, just some of the most outrageous, I never thought that I would see these kinds of things happening. How much of the funding would you say was through government grants? Because I would imagine any of those grants are going to be going away too.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of those government grants are state grants. So the state of California is looking to expand access to abortion. And so they might work with nonprofit organizations that field calls. So those kinds of things. So it really depends on what state you live in. If you live in Texas, it's going to be really hard. California is on the forefront of providing access to healthcare for the undocumented. And many RJ activists have asked me, like, how did you all do that? And it took decades of broad scale coalitions to get where we are now. And it takes, leadership. Governor Newsom is very much pushing back. But you're absolutely right. National legislation could make things incredibly dire. So I think it's safe to say that most reproductive justice advocates were shocked and stunned and really upset by the presidential election. I'm seeing now in board meetings that people are like, okay, here we go, like we're going to do it. And one of the things that had been planned before the election was three of the major national organizations had decided that they were going to form a coalition and apply for, if you're a nonprofit, you can't engage in partisan politics. You can educate people about legislation, but you can't advocate on behalf of politicians. They've decided to form, I believe it's called a 504, sorry, I'm spacing on the name, but anyway, it's a policy advocacy arm that has separate funding and can be partisan. And so there's now an effort to have this national coalition that will advocate on behalf of voter registration and voter suppression, to end voter suppression, on behalf of women's pregnant people's reproductive rights. And that effort is really going to, I think, be speeded up because they had anticipated doing this, sort of a several year rollout. Now they really feel like we've got to move quickly on this.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question from Farrell. They ask, where are reproductive justice activists getting the most traction?
That's a good question. I think California is getting a lot of traction. New York and surprisingly Texas. And I say surprisingly because on the one hand, National Latina Institute was involved in that lawsuit, the legislation that passed that if you help someone get an abortion, then you could be sued. They were named in that lawsuit that was eventually dropped. On the other hand, they have a core of activists that have been involved for years, so much so that they've now developed what they call the Poderosa Mountain. That is different steps where you come in and you're learning and you're getting involved. You've been involved for several years and you've taken different workshops, you get on to the next step. And so, each step you get to the top of the mountain and then you become like an activist yourself. And people are going through the mountain. There's a way in which they are continuing the work despite being in the belly of the beast. So Texas is one. National Latina Institute has satellite projects in New York, Virginia, Florida, and Texas. And of course, Florida is a really hard place to work. But they've got a small core. Colorado is a really great place. Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights, or CORLOR, is based in Denver, and they have built this great coalition, and they've got good legislation passed. They've defeated an attempt to change the state constitution to embrace fetal personhood. They've defeated that 3 times. They've got good collaboration with Planned Parenthood and other reproductive rights organizations. Illinois is another one, Chicago in particular. There are several organizations there. So, there are different pockets, but there's certainly a lot more work to be done. And many of these organizations are anticipating setting up satellites in the Southwest. So Utah and Arizona, in particular, are places where they're thinking about working.
I wonder if like when you say surprisingly Texas, I wonder if it's because of the stories that we're hearing out of Texas of women literally dying because they're denied, you know, the ability to, you know, terminate an unviable pregnancy. It's just so tragic, but at the same time, it's like it feels like with so many things, until people hear stories like that, you know, until they know a trans person, they can't have empathy or compassion. Do you know what I mean? It's a very
Yeah.
frustrating time to be alive.
Yeah, one of the things that they did in South Texas after the legislation that closed down so many clinics is they taught women how to do their own breast exam. And of course, some of them found lumps in their breast. So then they had to counsel women, what do you do if you find a lump in your breast? Like, you know, what is this all about? And so finding that multiple women in this organization found lumps in their breasts and were facing the same struggle. I mean, it generates so much compassion, but also so much anger. Like this should not be happening. So in many ways, it's really impressive, the activism that they're continuing despite the legislation.
Mm-hmm. This is a great question from Mark. He's asking, on a broader scale, is there anything we can do on the state and local level to counteract Trump's withdrawal from the World Health Organization, i.e., state and local alliance with who? WHO.
That's a really good question. You know, I'm a news junkie, and one of the things after went through my own depression, I got up and started watching news, and one of the things that I'm seeing on news channels is that when people push back, there's a response. And so, you know, all of the ways in which people are contacting their representatives and senators at the federal and the state level, like they can't just, you know, allow these things to happen. So that, you know, my first thought is do that, write letters to the editor, join local protests. Um, you know, like we can't just like sit back and let this happen. Some of my friends have decided to not listen to the news for the next year. I can't do that. I mean, that would mean giving them sanctioning the kinds of things that they're doing. And so I feel like we all need to find what makes sense for us.
Mm-hmm.
And if that means writing a letter or joining a protest or whatever, like I feel like we all need to become activists.
Yeah, and it's different for everybody. You know, Monday and Tuesday, I just was so stunned by, you know, the Nazi salute and then hearing about ICE raids locally here on day two. I I was beside myself, and like I said in my opening today, you know, there were some board members and staff with Secular AZ that really lifted me up, you know, and I think that we're all going to go through these phases where I just can't today, but there's somebody else who can. And then
Yeah.
maybe tomorrow I'll be able to do it and I'll be able to hold them up when they need it. You know, like that's what we need to do now. But I don't think that burying our heads in the sand is going to help anybody or anything. So,
Yeah, this movement would say that that's a form of healing justice, that we need to be in touch with one another, with our own emotions, and with our spiritual, whatever that means to you. And if that means holding somebody's hand, and you know, one of the EDs of one of these organizations, she said, I am not okay. Like, I cannot handle
mhm.
this. And 2 days later, there she was back in the field. You know, like we have to be there for one another.
Mhm. Um, One question that I have a few questions jotted down, but I saw something on Blue Sky today, and it was bringing up again the potential for Comstock, the Comstock Act, undoing all abortions. Can you speak to where we are with Comstock, and what do you think that that's going to be something that's used to ban abortion nationwide?
I wouldn't be surprised at all if they tried to do that. From what I've heard from lawyers and legal advocates, is that they very much are prepared to bring lawsuits and to try to stop it. And, you know, uh, uh, ACLU, all of these national advocacy groups, they've got their lawsuits prepped. They're ready to file them immediately. And, you know, they are very much going to try to mobilize to stop those kinds of legal restrictions. I hope they're successful.
One of the things that happens here, wait, there is a question. I'm willing to join protests and other resistance activities and have in the past when I had a contact in radical women, but I often don't hear about them in time. Is there a good source in this area, Maricopa County? And I don't know, Pat, if you would know the answer to that.
I don't know the answer. I mean, I know there are several immigrant rights organizations in Arizona that work along the border. I would try those to begin with. But there, and different universities, like one of my friends teaches my book, and she said every single term, students are ready to like get out there. So I would check websites of universities and student organizations. That's another possibility. And then, like what I know in Santa Cruz, like we have what we call a welcoming network that is just a bunch of people who are helping asylees. We have a civil rights organization that just had a demonstration for MLK birthday. I mean, those kinds of things might seem like they're not directly involved in reproductive rights, but you'll get to know people. You'll get to know what the organizations are. You'll get to know the landscape of activism, and you'll find people that you want to talk with and hang out with and get involved with. So we've all got to find our place.
And I see Ian chiming in on the chat here, and Ian is on our board of directors. He's very involved with other organizations. I think a great place in Arizona to start, we have a great organization called Civic Engagement Beyond Voting, where it's kind of a hub, I would say, for a lot of information. There's also Indivisible. Since the election, I've gotten so many great resources from Indivisible. There's so many local chapters too of Indivisible, and if there's not one in your area, you can start one. So I think those are great places to get connected locally. One thing I wanted to talk about, since you're speaking specifically of Black, Indigenous people of color and reproductive justice here, one of the narratives that comes up all the time when they are trying to take away our reproductive freedom is Margaret Sanger, that Black and brown babies are are aborted more. You know what I mean? Like, how do you combat that silly non-contextualized narrative? Do you have any suggestions? Because it's infuriating whenever I hear it.
Well, I think we should first of all pay attention to women of color have been involved in advocating for women's rights from the beginning, and that certain leaders got picked up by the press and were seen as the leaders really sort of ignored other kinds of activists. So we really need those histories, and I know some historians are writing those histories. I saw a lovely documentary about Native Americans' involvement in voting rights. We should lift up those histories. We should also pay attention to local organizations that are about other kinds of things besides reproductive rights, so that one of my personal missions is I was shocked when I found out about the movement for reproductive justice. I literally got an email out of the blue inviting me to an event, and I had never heard of it. And I taught intersectionality theory for decades. And so I couldn't understand, how did I not know about them? Well, because some of these organizations are small and they're very locally oriented, and they might do sort of national collaborations, but you don't hear about them in the national press, and they don't get picked up by Time magazine. So there's a way in which there's so much activism going on around us that we just don't know about. And if we all make efforts to try to discover that, I think you'll be surprised. Even I wrote a book about migration and poverty in Santa Cruz County, and there I learned about the incredible amount of activism here that I wasn't aware of. So, I think there's a lot for us to do. And instead of sitting home and being depressed and worried, start going and talking to people and finding out, what's available in your community. And you'll find lots of women of color involved in social activism around different issues.
Yeah, that I mean, it's very much true here, at our, reproductive table meetings that we have every week. It is a very, very diverse group of people, and it really is women of color who are leading the charge, and it's impressive. And I'm lucky to know so many of them. Um, this has been such a great discussion, and I like to close out our Friday discussions because in these times of the broligarchy, where everybody feels hopeless, and you said yourself that you're kind of a news junkie, what gives you hope these days?
That's a good question. I think what gives me hope is I'm an MSNBC news junkie in particular, besides a bunch of newspapers, is hearing the stories of how the lawyers, like, the attempt to withdraw birthright citizenship, which is in the Constitution, 22 states immediately joined the lawsuit. And, ACLU, immediately filed, like as soon as, he wrote that executive order. So I'm inspired by how prepared people are this time to push back. I think the first time we were all shocked, like, what? How could he do this? Now we're like, not in my watch. So I'm inspired by the stories of people doing something. And even if it's as simple as, you donate money to help an immigrant family survive, like whatever it is that helps you feel like I am not going to take this lying down, that's inspiring to me.
And I'm going to just give a quick shout out of somebody who's on this call today, Erica, because Erica spoke at the Capitol the other day, and I swear I could listen to Erica talk to the members of the committees any day of the week. So thank you, Erica, because this week you gave me hope, and she's here today. So with that, thank you so much, Pat. This has been such a great discussion, and you give me hope as well. So I hope that you and everybody on this call has a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.